My name is Dr. Micah Brandt, but they used to just call me her husband. That is, when they acknowledged me at all. For the longest time, I was nothing more than a shadow in the background of Astrid's brilliance. I had watched her ascend, watched as the world revered her intelligence, and stood by, muted and unnoticed, as she carved her name into a place of power. Yet, I never really resented it. I knew how it was. She was the star of the family, the one who lit up rooms with her ideas, her charm, her ambition. Me? I was just the guy she married. Just the man who kept the lights on, fed the kids, and fixed the occasional leaky faucet. But the day it all changed wasn't loud, it started in whispers. There was nothing extravagant about it, no explosion or dramatic confrontation. It was just a family dinner, one of those obligatory gatherings we had at Dr. Harold Lennox's sprawling estate. My father-in-law, the god of medical research in our world. The man who could make even the most cutting-edge discoveries sound like bedtime stories. I had long learned to take a back seat whenever he was around. He was the type of man who didn't believe in subtlety. He made it clear he thought little of my career or my aspirations. In fact, he once publicly told a room full of donors that I had dropped out of med school to pursue less demanding interests. The room erupted with laughter. It wasn't a joke. Not really. I remember that moment as if it were yesterday, sitting at the far end of the table, just close enough to hear the laughter, just far enough away to be invisible. My seat was right by the door. I could practically feel the draft of every entrance and exit. It was a deliberate choice. No one wanted to sit next to me, not my wife, not my brother-in-law Julius, not even the strangers they had invited. When I opened my mouth to speak, Astrid pressed her hand lightly on my arm, a subtle yet unmistakable gesture. "Don't make this about you," she whispered, her voice sharp, but somehow hollow. And that's when it hit me. That's when I realized they wanted me erased. I had become nothing more than a name on a form. Just a placeholder, an afterthought, in a family of brilliant minds. Harold had built an empire on his reputation, and Astrid had carved out her place beside him. I had married into this world, thinking that it would be an opportunity for us both to rise together. Instead, I had been relegated to the background, ignored in favor of her accomplishments, and when I dared to make my own mark, it was met with condescension or outright dismissal. I remember that night clearly. The way the laughter echoed in my ears, the way Astrid's touch on my arm felt more like an anchor than a comfort. The way I sat there, unable to speak, unable to ask for anything more. That was the day they cut me out. Not with a harsh word, not with a dramatic act. No, they did it with silence, with subtlety. They erased me without even noticing. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't let it go any longer. I couldn't keep pretending that it didn't matter. As the dinner dragged on, I found myself just listening, just observing, watching as they all swirled around me in their world of accomplishments and connections. They made plans, discussed research, and celebrated Julius's latest achievement, all the while ignoring the man sitting quietly by the door. I knew then that I would have to build something of my own, something undeniable, something they couldn't erase, no matter how hard they tried. The night ended as quietly as it began. Harold gave me one of his patented nods of dismissal, and Astrid barely met my eyes before we left. She didn't speak to me on the drive home. Neither of us did. I couldn't help but think that this had been the moment when everything changed. It was no longer just about proving myself to them. It was about proving something to myself. That I didn't need their approval. That I was worth more than the shadows they had cast me into. That I could become something more than the man who merely held their coats. The next few months passed in a blur of hospital rounds and academic conferences, but in the back of my mind, something was always simmering. I wasn't content to remain a footnote in their story. I wasn't content to let them define me. I had my own vision, my own future to build. I was done playing by their rules, done accepting the scraps they tossed my way. In the quiet of my office, late into the night, I began to build. I wrote algorithms, designed diagnostic models, created new ways to help patients in the most dire of circumstances. And with every line of code, I began to strip away the limitations they had placed on me. But even as I built my future, I couldn't shake the feeling that it would always be tied to them, always be measured against the legacy they had created. Astrid, Harold, Julius. They had erased me, yes, but they had also created a world where my name would always be measured against theirs. That would always be the challenge, wouldn't it? To prove that I wasn't just the man behind them, that I wasn't just the man in the background anymore. And so, I worked in silence, knowing that one day, I would be ready to show them who I truly was. Not the man they wanted to erase, but the man I had always been. And when that moment came, I would make sure the world knew my name. No more shadows. No more silence. Just the truth, loud and clear. Back then, Harold Lennox and I were working together on what could have been one of the most groundbreaking projects of our time, non-invasive diagnostic sequencing using machine learning. The idea was revolutionary. Use real-time data collected from basic vitals and wearable technology to identify early signs of heart disease long before symptoms manifested. I'd spent months developing the prototype algorithm, running simulations, compiling data from case studies, cross-referencing published journals, and refining the logic. I barely slept during that stretch, living off coffee and late-night takeout while Astrid told herself I was just being obsessive again. Harold had originally shown interest in my prototype during one of our infrequent conversations at the hospital's research wing. He wasn't a tech guy, never had been. His genius was deeply clinical, theoretical, and political. But he recognized when something could elevate his already legendary reputation. He invited me to collaborate. Those were his words. Let's make this a joint contribution. Your algorithm, my clinical validation, it'll be a winning combination, he said, clapping me on the back like a father rewarding a son for cutting the lawn. I believed him. That was my mistake. We worked side by side for 3 months. Well, I worked. He reviewed, nodded, and occasionally tossed in an idea that sounded more like a PR pitch than a scientific contribution. But I didn't argue. Not then. Because this was how it worked in that world. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you needed names like his attached to your work. You needed to rent credibility until you built your own. That's what I kept telling myself whenever he brushed off questions or redirected interviews about our research. Then one morning, I was standing in line at a cafe near the hospital, waiting for my usual triple espresso when I saw it, front page placement in a leading medical journal. Revolutionizing Cardiac Pre-Diagnostics, a new model by Dr. Harold Lennox. My mouth dried instantly. I pulled up the digital version, skimmed to the bottom, searching for my name. Nothing. Not even a footnote. I must have read it 10 times just to be sure. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he submitted a different version of our project. Maybe this was preliminary. But when I opened the methodology section and saw my algorithm, my framework, laid out with only minor cosmetic changes, I knew. He'd stolen it, presented it as his own. When I got home that evening, Astrid was already curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. She greeted me with a distracted, "Hey," not even glancing up from her tablet. I asked her if she had seen the journal. She nodded. Harold showed it to me earlier. Pretty exciting stuff. I paused. You didn't notice anything missing? She raised an eyebrow, like I'd asked a ridiculous question. What do you mean? My name, Astrid. I worked on that paper with him. Hell, I wrote the paper. It's my algorithm. He didn't even credit me. Her face barely moved. She blinked, then shrugged. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Maybe he submitted it quickly and forgot. Forgot. I repeated, voice rising. You don't forget the person who designed the foundation of your entire paper. You're overreacting, Micah, she said calmly, taking another sip. You always do this when it comes to recognition. That stung. Not because she said it, but because she believed it. In her mind, I was the one being dramatic, petty, jealous. And Harold? He was incapable of betrayal. He was the pillar of their family, the man who walked into any room and commanded reverence. Why would he need to steal anything? I should have fought harder right then, but I didn't. I let it go. Not because I was weak, not because I believed her, but because I knew the game was rigged and I wasn't about to win this round by shouting in my own living room. Instead, I got quiet, focused. While Harold did interviews and gave talks on his discovery, I began writing new code, testing new theories. I dove deeper into the integration of AI diagnostics with emergency response systems. I began reaching out to institutions beyond our sphere, hospitals that weren't dazzled by last names but by results. I took freelance consultation gigs under a pseudonym. It wasn't about hiding. It was about freedom. No more strings. No more borrowed credibility. I was going to earn mine. I had to watch, silently, as Astrid congratulated her father at family events. She brought up his paper at brunches, praised him during Zoom calls with colleagues, even suggested that I help him prep for a conference keynote he was headlining. Help him prep for a speech about my work. I politely declined, told her I was swamped. What I didn't tell her was that I was building a prototype of my next-generation diagnostic model, one that was faster, cleaner, and capable of remote deployment in underdeveloped regions. The kind of tech that didn't just win awards, it saved lives. And all the while, I stayed silent about the paper. Let Harold collect his praise. Let Astrid think I had moved on. Because I wasn't chasing acknowledgement anymore, I was preparing something bigger. A body of work so comprehensive, so undeniable, that no one would be able to erase my name from it. I wasn't just building a project. I was building a future they couldn't take credit for. But some nights, when the house was quiet and my screen glowed in the dark, I'd wonder why it hurt so much. It wasn't the paper. Not really. It was what the theft meant. That Harold didn't see me as a partner. That Astrid didn't see me as someone worth defending. That my worth, to them, was conditional on convenience. I had given everything I had to that family. My loyalty, my ideas, my silence. And in return, they offered me erasure. But I knew something they didn't. The best revenge isn't loud. It's legacy. The ballroom at the Boston Sheraton was all glass and chandeliers, pretentious, over-designed, a palace for egos wrapped in white coats. It was the closing day of the North American Medical Innovations Conference, and I stood beside my poster presentation, waiting, just waiting. The sea of suits flowed past me, eyes skipping over the work like it was just a placeholder between the real attractions. I'd been invited as a research fellow representing a small university on the West Coast. No headline billing, no spotlight. I was slotted between a lecture on surgical adhesives and a networking brunch. That's where they thought I belonged. But I was there, and my poster wasn't just filler. It was the culmination of 2 years of silent work, refining the diagnostic algorithm that could flag myocardial degeneration with just 5 biometric indicators. I stood beside it like a man guarding a secret too big to shout. Across the lobby, the crowd began to shift toward the main stage. People filed into the auditorium, programs clutched in their hands, muttering excitedly about the keynote honoree. And there he was, Dr. Harold Lennox, wearing his signature navy 3-piece suit, shaking hands, smiling for photos. He was being awarded for his pioneering advancements in early cardiovascular diagnostics. My heart didn't sink. That's the thing. I wasn't surprised. This wasn't betrayal anymore. This was routine. My name was nowhere near his slides. Again. And the language he used in his abstract? Nearly word for word from the paper he published without me. The same one Astrid said was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that now had him standing on a lit stage receiving a standing ovation while I stood beside a laminated poster no one read. He never even looked in my direction. And then came the introduction. A booming voice from the stage. Dr. Harold Lennox, innovator, mentor, and father to some of the most brilliant rising minds in the field. They meant Astrid. And I suppose, in some sick way, they also meant me. The rising mind he kept beneath the dirt. After the applause faded and Harold began to speak, I turned back to my little station. I adjusted the edges of my poster, aligned the handouts on the table, even though no one was coming to take one. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to impress. I was here to document, to witness what it felt like to be erased in real time. Eventually, a couple of graduate students wandered over. One asked me to explain the algorithm, more out of obligation than interest. I walked them through it, succinctly, clearly, as if I were reciting steps in a trauma room. Their eyes glazed. They nodded. Then they moved on, their heads swiveling toward the auditorium, toward the echo of Harold's voice. The gravity of that man's legacy pulled everything toward it. I packed up early. Didn't wait for the end. I slipped out through the back, a rolled poster in one hand, the other gripping my phone. I got back to the hotel in under 15 minutes. I didn't even turn on the lights when I entered the room. I just dropped the poster tube beside the couch and stood in the dark, still dressed in my conference suit, my throat dry. Astrid wasn't there. She had stayed back in New York to oversee some hospital funding proposal. That's what she said. But I knew the real reason. She didn't want to be in the room when her father accepted praise for the work her husband built. Or maybe she just didn't want to face the awkwardness, the guilt. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, jacket still buttoned. My laptop waited on the desk. I stared at it, the screen dimmed to a pulsing sleep. Then, slowly, I stood and opened it. Logged in, created a blank file. The document named itself, Untitled. I typed the first words without thinking, let them lie. Just keep building the truth. It felt right. It felt like the only thing I could control. I wasn't going to spend another second trying to claw back credit from people who never planned to give it. I wasn't going to beg for acknowledgement or ask for fairness. That wasn't my fight anymore. My fight was building something so complete, so undeniable, that they wouldn't be able to explain it away. So I wrote. I wrote about new datasets, about integrating pulse ox variability and sleep cycle disruptions into predictive models. I wrote about mobile diagnostic kits for remote triage in war zones. I wrote code that pulled real-time hospital telemetry into predictive dashboards. I wasn't trying to win applause. I was trying to create tools that worked, that mattered. And I kept writing, long into the night. At some point, I heard a notification ding on my phone. A message from Julius. Saw you were at the conference. Didn't see your name on any schedule, though. Everything okay? I stared at the message for a full minute before deleting it. I didn't reply. Because what could I say? That I had been 500 feet away from his father and might as well have been invisible? That everything I had poured into their world had been taken, misused, and dressed up in praise? No, I didn't need their sympathy. I needed my own momentum. The next morning, I didn't go back to the conference. I rented a car and drove to a small research center north of Cambridge. A colleague from my fellowship years had invited me months ago to discuss a partnership, one that had nothing to do with the Linux name. They gave me a tour of their lab, introduced me to their head of data infrastructure, and sat me down for a real talk about funding. They wanted my work, not my surname, not my ties, just the work. As I left the facility, the sun broke through the gray Boston haze. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost. That night, back in the hotel room, I opened the same document, added a new line beneath the first. Don't fight for their table. Build your own. I wasn't going to ask for a seat anymore. I was going to build the entire room. And I would furnish it with proof, with patents, with lives saved. And no matter how many stages Harold stood on, or how many jokes Astrid cracked to deflect from my silence, the truth would keep growing. Like light beneath a locked door. They could pretend I failed, but they couldn't stop what I was building. Silence doesn't always come in the form of absence. Sometimes, it sits beside you at a family brunch, dressed in tailored cream linen and a glass of orange juice, laughing along with the people who've spent years slicing your value down to a joke. That was Astrid, my wife, the daughter of a star, the woman who once held my chin in her palms and said I was brilliant, destined, remarkable. That woman had been replaced by someone who knew how to play the room and chose to do it without me. We were seated at her cousin Bianca's penthouse overlooking Hudson Yards. White marble, chrome bar stools, and a curated playlist of sterile jazz played too softly to notice until you realized no one had stopped it in 2 hours. Astrid and I were perched at the edge of the conversation, not because we were excluded, but because that's where I was supposed to stay. A prop, the supportive spouse, the doctor who never really made it. Bianca was halfway through her second mimosa when she looked at me with that faux-curious expression of hers, the kind people wear when they want to sound interested but never plan to remember the answer. So, she said, dragging the word out. Are you still doing that? What was it? Coding stuff? I smiled. A flat, practiced one. I'm still doing tech-driven diagnostics. Astrid didn't let the silence linger. She jumped in, all brightness and polish. Oh, Mike is doing tech-adjacent stuff now. He's great with spreadsheets. Spreadsheets. My spine stiffened. Spreadsheets. I was currently contracted with 3 cardiac research institutions and had been cited in a German white paper as a pioneering force in portable cardiovascular anomaly mapping. And to the woman I married, the one who had seen me break nights to debug a single faulty line of code, my life's work was reduced to spreadsheets. I didn't correct her. That was the sickest part. I didn't say a word. I watched her sip from her glass and flash that pleasant, empty smile to the rest of the table as if nothing had just been buried beneath it. As if she hadn't just chosen to minimize me in front of her family, again. Because it was. The conversation moved on. Talk of property taxes and promotions. Bianca's husband had just been recruited to a hedge fund. There were congratulations and toasts. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching Astrid. Watching how easily she played this part. How comfortably she leaned into the narrative that I was simply a mild-mannered background character who worked with data and cleaned up nicely. The one they didn't have to Google. What hit me hardest wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't say. She never told them what I had built. Never mentioned the emergency alert framework I had deployed in low-income clinics across the Pacific Northwest. Never brought up the peer-reviewed paper that had quietly gained traction in academic circles abroad. Never told them about the late nights, the funding rejections turned approvals, the way I turned failure into function while keeping food on the table when she was climbing ladders made of other people's backs. I stared into my coffee and thought, she doesn't want them to know. She doesn't want me seen. Because to her, I was safest when small. After brunch, as we walked to the parking garage, I didn't say anything. Neither did she. We were quiet for 2 city blocks before she reached for my hand. It was automatic. Not loving. Not sorry. Just muscle memory. You were quiet today, she said lightly, like she was asking about the weather. Spreadsheets, I said, barely masking the bite in my tone. She sighed. Micah, it's just easier. You know how they are. I know exactly how they are, I replied. I just didn't expect you to blend in so easily. She stopped walking. Her hand dropped away. This again. I turned to face her. It's not about them anymore, Astrid. It's about you. You've made a choice to stand beside them instead of me. She looked away, lips pressed tight. You want me to start lecturing them at brunch about your credentials? You want me to list your grants like some PR manager? No, I said quietly. I want you to speak the truth when it's right in front of you. That's it. She didn't respond. She just resumed walking, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. And I followed, not because I wanted to, but because I still lived in the same apartment. Shared the same bed. Still, technically, called her my wife. That night, she slipped into bed beside me and turned to face the wall. I stared at the ceiling. I didn't touch her. Didn't speak. And in that silence, a decision started taking shape in me. I would stop trying to be understood in this house. I would stop reaching for her hand every time she dropped mine. They didn't want to hear my story. Fine. I'd let them live in their curated fiction. But I would build louder in the shadows. I would write papers under initials, submit projects through anonymous collectives, collect citations that had nothing to do with Harold Lennox or his circles of influence. I would make myself undeniable, not for their approval, but for my own. I didn't need to be seen at their table. I would build my own. So, I gave them what they wanted. Silence. At dinners, I said little. At family gatherings, I nodded when spoken to. I smiled in photos. But behind that smile, I was writing code. Building systems, studying patterns, designing tools to flag medical anomalies in seconds. I knew where I was going, even if they didn't. And one day, when the silence finally shattered, it wouldn't be me doing the talking. It would be the work. And it would speak loud enough to wake every single person who had ever smiled through my erasure. I hadn't planned to return to Lennox Memorial. I avoided that place like a room haunted by a past that never fully died. But fate, or irony, had a better sense of humor than I ever gave it credit for. The invitation came by email. Dr. Micah Brandt, we would be honored to have you attend the annual West Coast Medical Integration Symposium hosted at Lennox Memorial Hospital. It was signed by the new event coordinator, someone clearly unaware of the personal landmines scattered across that hospital floor for me. At first, I almost declined. Just hit delete and moved on. But the name gnawed at me. Lennox. The name on every plaque. The name I used to carry like a stone in my throat every time someone introduced me as Dr. Lennox's son-in-law. Not Dr. Brandt. Just someone attached to someone else. So I RSVP'd yes. Not out of vengeance. Not out of some melodramatic need to make a point. I did it because I wasn't hiding anymore. And because there's power in letting the ghosts see that you survived them. The day of the symposium, I arrived through the staff entrance. Not because I needed to. Because that's how I trained myself. Quiet entrances. Humble arrivals. No fanfare. Badge clipped to my coat. I signed in and bypassed the reception lobby entirely. But I wasn't there as a guest this time. I was there as Chief Medical Director of the Kellerman Institute, a title that carried weight in the medical world, just not in the one Harold built like a throne room. As I moved through the familiar halls, old memories clawed at the edges of my mind. Long nights as a junior resident, waiting for Astrid to finish her rounds. The cafeteria's awful lentil soup. The endless rounds of applause Harold received at every donor dinner, most of which I'd stood through quietly, clapping with a neutral face. The symposium had barely started when the emergency code rang out. Code Blue, Trauma Unit 2. Instinct overruled everything. The presenter was still at the podium, mid-slide. People froze. I didn't. My legs moved before my brain fully caught up. I ran. When I got there, the room was already in chaos. A teenage boy had collapsed in the hallway outside imaging. No ID. No history. just flatlining vitals and a panicked intern trying chest compressions without rhythm. A nurse was shouting for crash cart clearance. I swept in, hands steady, voice louder than the confusion. Back up. I've got this. Nobody argued. My badge said enough. In under 4 minutes, we had a pulse. He was stabilized. Breathing. The room settled like the last breath of a storm. Everyone exhaled, some with relief, some still unsure of what had just happened. And then I heard it. Wait, are you Dr. Brandt? The chief. I turned. The voice belonged to a young nurse, maybe 25. Bright-eyed. Cheeks flushed from the rush. Her gaze moved between my badge and my face, recognition blooming like sunlight over water. Yes, I said. My voice was calm, even. Her eyes widened. I read your paper on mobile diagnostics and disaster zones. It changed the way we triage in the clinic I used to work at. I didn't know you'd be here today. Before I could respond, I felt it, the weight of old eyes. I turned slightly, and there they were. Harold, Astrid, Julius, frozen in the corridor's entrance like ghosts caught in a floodlight. Harold's face, usually composed in a rigid mask of superiority, was cracked, just slightly. His lips parted, not in greeting, not in command, but in confusion. Like he was seeing a painting he thought had been burned long ago hanging in a museum he didn't remember funding. Astrid looked pale, a shade I hadn't seen on her face since the day we buried her mother. Her mouth moved like she wanted to say my name, but the words didn't find air. And Julius? He said it. Wait him. It wasn't shock. It was something darker. A bruise to the ego. I didn't belong here, not in their eyes. I was supposed to still be that man fumbling for relevance at brunches. The guy who almost finished. I didn't move toward them. I didn't speak. I simply turned back to the nurse. You said your clinic used the protocol? She nodded, still catching her breath. Last winter. Rural Washington. We ran out of imaging resources during a snowstorm, and the mobile diagnostics kept 3 patients from being misdiagnosed. We still use your model. Behind her, Harold was still standing, still silent. The moment was surgical in its precision. There was no speech, no vindictive flourish. Just that nurse, eyes bright with admiration. That boy, still alive because I had done the work no one clapped for. And them, watching a truth they had spent years burying rise like a ghost they couldn't kill. Astrid finally blinked. Her fingers curled into her coat sleeves. She looked at me the way someone looks at a painting they once threw out, now hanging behind bulletproof glass. I gave a soft nod to the nurse. Thank you for telling me. She smiled, oblivious to the drama thickening behind her. And me? I didn't look back at them again, because in that moment, I realized something deeper than validation. The power isn't in being seen. It's in becoming undeniable. And no matter how many times they erased my name, the world had already started writing it in ink. It was the look on Harold's face that haunted me more than the silence. That moment in Trauma Unit 2 had cracked something in him. Not loudly, not publicly, but in a way he couldn't glue back together with prestige or denial. For once, he wasn't the one commanding the room. For once, I didn't look at him for approval. I didn't have to. That nurse, the way she said my name like it carried weight, like it mattered, had done what Astrid never could. She'd acknowledged me in front of them not as an accessory, not as a footnote, but as a force. And Harold had to stand there and watch it happen, powerless to interrupt, unable to spin it into something more convenient for his narrative. I could feel the heat of their stares as I filled out my report. I took my time, not for drama, just because I wasn't rushing anymore. I'd spent too long shrinking myself to fit into rooms built for his ego. Now, I stood where I belonged. I caught Astrid's reflection in the glass panel to my right. She was still in the hallway, half-turned like she couldn't decide whether to stay or flee. Julius was speaking to her in low tones, gesturing with quick flicks of his hand like he couldn't make sense of what he'd seen. But Harold didn't move. He just stood there, arms folded tight across his chest, the corner of his mouth twitching like he was fighting against some truth clawing its way out. I didn't speak to them. I simply turned in my report and left the trauma wing. I didn't owe them an explanation. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, after the symposium resumed, I walked through the main corridor, heading for the lecture hall where I was scheduled to sit on a panel about decentralized diagnostics. The room was half full when I arrived, early as usual. I took a seat near the end of the table, opened my folder, and reviewed my notes, not because I was unprepared, but because it grounded me. I felt him before I saw him. Harold. He stepped in without fanfare, his expression composed but unreadable. He walked up to the moderator, shook a few hands, and then turned his attention to me. He nodded once, that same clinical nod he gave interns in the OR, acknowledgement without warmth. "Dr. Brandt," he said evenly, as if the events of that morning had been a distant dream. I looked up, my voice calm. "Dr. Lennox." He hesitated, just for a second. Then he cleared his throat. "That was good work earlier." I didn't thank him. "I didn't realize you were affiliated with Kellerman now," he added. Chief Medical Director. The title echoed in my mind, not out of ego, but out of all the years it took to earn it while they looked the other way. "For almost 2 years now," I said. Harold's jaw tightened. "That paper on disaster diagnostics, was that your work too?" I didn't smile. "All of it." He gave a stiff nod, like each word I said chipped at the wall he'd built around his version of the truth. "Well," he muttered, as if searching for a response that didn't exist, "it's getting a lot of attention." "It's not about the attention," I said. "It's about the work." That made him pause. Just long enough. "You could have told us," he said finally. "All these years, you could have said something." I closed the folder and looked him straight in the eye. "I did. You just never listened." That landed. I saw it in the flicker of his expression. For a man who'd always lived with the comfort of being the loudest voice in the room, being reminded that he ignored the quiet ones shook him in a way no scandal ever could. He didn't reply. He turned and left, fading into a small group of surgeons near the stage. The panel started. We discussed the future of diagnostics, AI integration, global accessibility. I shared my research, my insights. My name was on the placard. My voice was heard. And not a single person asked me who I was married to. After the panel ended, several attendees came up to shake my hand. A researcher from Tokyo wanted to translate my latest paper for use in remote Japanese clinics. Another offered collaboration with a trauma unit in Kenya. I gave them both my contact card. As I stepped into the hallway again, the crowd parted briefly. Astrid stood at the far end, half shadowed by the frame of a large window. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't dressed in her usual social armor, either. Just a plain navy blouse, her hair pulled back, no pretense in her expression. She didn't approach. She didn't wave. She just watched me. And in her eyes, for the first time, I saw it, not confusion, not disappointment, regret. Not because she hadn't believed in me, but because she finally realized she'd never even looked. I walked past her, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because I didn't need to stop. There was nothing left to explain, no proof left to give. I had done what they never thought I would. I became someone without their permission. And the look on Harold's face that morning, that flicker of realization, wasn't just about what I had done. It was about what he hadn't. About all the moments he had the chance to lift someone up and chose instead to cast a longer shadow. About how the empire he built was suddenly dwarfed by a truth he didn't write. They thought erasing my name would erase my purpose. But all it did was focus me. Now they had to watch as everything they ignored became everything they couldn't avoid. And that look? That stunned, broken thing behind Harold's eyes? That was the sound of legacy cracking. The thing about reputations, especially ones built on borrowed brilliance, is that they don't shatter all at once. They fracture in silence, first in whispers, then in doubt, then in the unmistakable tilt of heads and raised brows during conversations that used to end in applause. Harold Lennox had spent his life building a name that couldn't be questioned, a legacy wrapped in accolades, medical endowments, and honorary titles. But all it took was one day, one moment. One look too long at a badge that didn't say his name. Words spread faster than I ever could have orchestrated. I didn't need to post a thing. The photo from the trauma unit, the moment I stabilized the teenage patient while wearing a Kellerman Institute coat, hit the hospital's internal bulletin within 24 hours. It wasn't even a headline. Just a brief update. Dr. Micah Brandt, visiting chief medical director, stepped in during emergency code and administered successful intervention. Lennox Memorial thanks Dr. Brandt for his contribution. That was all it took. The board chair forwarded it to the executive council. Department heads began to piece together the strange puzzle. Dr. Brandt, the one Harold used to call tech-adjacent, was now the person saving lives in their hallways. I didn't have to announce myself. I didn't need a press tour. The truth had legs of its own. By the end of the week, Harold's assistant sent me a meeting request. Subject line, clarifying discussion. I let it sit in my inbox for 2 days. Then I clicked accept. The meeting was scheduled in a mid-sized conference room on the top floor of the administrative wing. It was glass on 3 sides, high ceilings, surrounded by shelves full of awards, photos of Harold shaking hands with governors and presidents. I walked in alone. No entourage, no assistant, just my credentials in a black folder under my arm. Harold was already seated. He looked more tired than usual, though he masked it with his usual rigid posture and a pressed suit that tried to declare normalcy. He nodded as I entered, but didn't rise. "Micah," he said. I didn't return the courtesy. "Dr. Lennox." He got straight to it. "There's been some confusion circulating about your involvement in certain projects over the past few years." "Confusion?" I echoed, setting the folder on the table. "Or correction?" He didn't answer. He glanced toward the boardroom window, as if hoping someone would interrupt this conversation. I opened the folder and slid it toward him. "My credentials. Updated. Current titles. Patents filed. Publications, some with international citations. My full portfolio." He opened it slowly. I watched his eyes scan the documents. The numbers. The co-signed fellowships. The letter from the Geneva Emergency Consortium naming me as one of the top 10 innovators in applied diagnostics this year. His silence grew thicker with each line he read. "These weren't submitted through our joint platform," he said eventually, almost to himself. "No," I replied. "They weren't. I would have supported you, had you." I didn't let him finish. "You didn't support me when I was writing code in your basement lab. You didn't support me when you removed my name from a paper I wrote. You didn't support me when I was presenting at conferences alone while you collected awards for work that wasn't yours. So no, I didn't come to you again. I just did the work." He looked up at me. For the first time, I saw something that resembled vulnerability in his eyes. Not remorse. Just the sick realization that the foundation he built now had a fault line with my name etched into it. "I never saw you as a threat," he said quietly. "That was your mistake," I said. "I was never trying to be a threat. I was just trying to be seen." The door opened behind us. One of the board members, Dr. Yvonne St. James, stepped in. She greeted me first, shook my hand, then turned to Harold and nodded coolly. "Let's begin," she said. It wasn't a private meeting after all. What followed was the first public reckoning Harold had likely faced in his career. Dr. St. James asked him to confirm the timeline of our collaboration. She asked how the diagnostic sequencing paper was authored, what role I had played in its development. She pulled out a copy of the original draft, my original draft, with metadata showing my name as the original file creator. Harold squirmed in his seat, posture still straight but voice thinner than usual. There was a miscommunication at the time, an oversight. I'd intended to revise the credits. Yvonne looked at me. "Is that true, Dr. Brandt?" "No," I said simply. "That revision never came. Not when the paper was published. Not when he received the award. Not when he was asked in an interview about his team and he said, 'I mostly worked alone.'" The room went quiet. Then Yvonne spoke again. "Dr. Lennox will need to perform a formal review of co-authorship records for any recent research connected to your name. Effective immediately." He didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly. That's how it begins. The cracks. Not with someone shouting fraud in a lecture hall. Not with tabloids. With questions. With records. With truths whispered into the right ears at the right moment. As I left the room, Julia sent me a text. "Why, D?" I didn't hit send. I didn't need to. I just put the phone down. Because that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to beg. It waits. And when it comes, it brings with it a silence that cuts deeper than applause. Harold's reputation hadn't fallen. Not completely, but the first fracture had formed. And now it would spread. The knock on my hotel door came late. Past 11. I was seated on the couch, still dressed from the evening's panel, scrolling through a list of incoming research partnership requests that had started pouring into my Kellerman inbox. They came from Tokyo, Berlin, Rio de Janeiro, places that never cared about who I'd married or which legacy I stood in the shadow of. They just cared about what I'd built. The knock came again, softer the second time, hesitant. I stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Astrid. No makeup. No armor. Her blazer was wrinkled at the elbows, hair pulled into a loose knot that looked like she'd stopped caring somewhere between the elevator and the hallway. Her eyes darted up to mine, and for a second, she looked like a stranger who couldn't remember the room number she meant to knock on. "Can I come in?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of that pause, to remember it later. Then I stepped aside. She walked in without speaking. Her hands fidgeted at her sides. She didn't sit, just stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the silence she used to protect herself with. This time, it folded in on her like a curtain pulled back too far. "I didn't know," she finally said, turning to face me. I didn't realize how far you'd come." I crossed my arms, leaning against the desk. "No, Astrid. You chose not to look." That hit her. Not like a slap. More like cold water down the back. Slow and shocking. She nodded faintly, as if rehearsing an apology she had only now realized didn't fit the crime. "I should have said something at brunch," she murmured. "When Bianca mocked your work. When my father, when he called me the guy who almost finished?" I cut in. She winced. "Yes." I let the silence stretch until it bent. "And what did you say, Astrid? What did you ever say when they laughed at me? When they left me out of every conversation that mattered? I thought," she paused, eyes shining, "I thought you didn't care about that kind of recognition." I scoffed. "No. You thought it was easier if I didn't. You wanted me quiet. Neat. Out of the way so you wouldn't have to choose between their version of me and the real one." Her voice cracked. "That's not fair. It's the truth." She looked around the room like it might offer her shelter. Her gaze landed on the folder I'd left on the table earlier. It was still half open, a few pages visible. Charts, graphs, and one letter with the Kellerman Institute seal. Her hand moved toward it, then stopped. "You really built all of this without me?" she asked. I met her eyes. "No, I built it in spite of you." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't soften. I'd done enough softening over the years, bending myself to keep her comfortable, to make her feel like she hadn't picked wrong. I spent years becoming invisible so she wouldn't have to defend me at her family's table. She sat down finally, folding into the edge of the armchair like she was afraid it might reject her too. "I just want things to go back," she said. "Back to when we were still." "What?" I asked. "When I stayed silent, and you pretended I was content being erased?" "No," she whispered. "Back to when we could still fix this." I stared at her. "You don't want to fix anything. You want the silence back." That tore the mask off. Her face crumpled, not from shock, but recognition. She knew it was true. She didn't come here for reconciliation. She came because the silence had shifted, and now it was swallowing her instead of me. "I loved you," she said, crying now. "I still do." I shook my head. "You loved the version of me that didn't need defending. The one who stayed quiet so you could shine brighter without shadow. But you don't get to love someone and stand beside the people who erase him." She buried her face in her hands. I stood still, arms crossed, heart steady. I wanted to feel something watching her cry. Maybe anger. Maybe pity. Maybe the ache of a door half open. But I felt nothing but clarity. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she choked out. "But you did," I said. "And you kept doing it, every time you smiled through their jokes. Every time you nodded while Harold dismissed me. Every time you let them tell the world that I was lucky just to be in your orbit." She looked up, mascara now smudged at the corners of her eyes. "Is this it? Are we done?" I let the question hang there. I thought about all the years I spent waiting for her to see me, for her to choose me over convenience. And now, with her sitting in my hotel room asking if the end had already come and gone, I realized it had ended long before tonight. It ended the moment I stopped shrinking myself to fit the version of me she could tolerate. "We've been done," I said softly. "This is just the first time you've heard the echo." She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. I didn't offer her support. She walked to the door, paused, her back to me. "You're not the man I married." "No," I agreed. "I'm the man you were afraid I'd become." And then she left. The door clicked shut behind her, soft as a sigh. I stood there for a long while, staring at the space where she'd sat, the tear stains she left on the chair's fabric already fading. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Because when Astrid finally spoke, it wasn't to apologize. It wasn't even to make it right. It was to mourn the silence she could no longer control. And I had no intention of offering it back. Weeks passed, and the world did what it always does. It moved forward. But this time, it moved in my direction. The invitation arrived in a box, not an envelope. Heavy, matte black, embossed with a silver seal, Global Medical Innovation Forum, keynote invitation. I turned it over in my hands, letting the weight of it settle in my chest. For years, I had watched men like Harold take that stage. Men who recycled brilliance, who passed off collaborations as solo victories, who shook hands with billionaires while the real architects of progress sat at the back, uncredited. But now, it was my name engraved in chrome script at the top of the program. Dr. Micah Brandt, Chief Medical Director, Kellerman Institute. Keynote address. I didn't tell anyone. Not Astrid. Not Julius. Not Harold. The day arrived crisp and overcast in New York, just enough gray to make the world feel reflective. I stepped out of the black car at the Grand Rotunda Hall, dressed in a charcoal suit, the same watch I wore through residency class around my wrist. Not expensive. Not flashy. Just mine. Earned. Paid for with every overlooked paper, every erased contribution, every "he's Astrid's husband" muttered in polished hallways. Inside, the room was immaculate. Crystal chandeliers. Velvet chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle around the podium. Attendees from over 30 countries, CEOs, research directors, policymakers. I scanned the crowd, not expecting to find any familiar faces. Until I did. Second row. Slightly to the left. Harold Lennox. Of course he was here. He had to be. The forum was one of his domains, another stage he had claimed long before I ever imagined I could stand on one. His posture was stiff, jaw set like he was bracing for a diagnosis he couldn't control. His hands were folded, no notepad, no phone. Just watching. Waiting. I didn't flinch. The chairwoman approached the podium and began her welcome remarks, her voice calm, confident. Then, she paused and looked toward me. It is with great pride that we welcome today's keynote speaker, an innovator whose quiet contributions have reshaped how we approach early-stage cardiac diagnostics across continents. Please welcome Dr. Micah Brandt. The applause came fast. Crisp. Not pity claps. Not polite applause. Respect. Recognition. I stood and walked to the stage, heartbeat steady, breath even. I didn't look at Harold. I didn't need to. He had already seen more than he wanted to. I knew what kind of man it took to clap for someone who tried to erase. I reached the podium and looked out at the crowd. Then I began. Some contributions don't come with credit, I said. Some names are left off the plaque. Some hands that shape progress are never photographed, never quoted. They live in basements, in unmarked labs, behind screens, behind people. The room quieted. For years, I believed that in order to change the world, I needed permission to be seen. I waited for recognition, for an invitation to sit at tables where my work already fed the conversation. A pause, just enough to feel the room lean in. But legacy isn't a plaque. It isn't applause. Legacy is what you build in silence and make undeniable. I continued. I spoke of innovation in places with no power grid, about algorithms that had already saved hundreds of lives, about funding mobile clinics instead of marble lobbies, about medicine stripped of performance. Just work. Just impact. When I finished, they stood. All of them. The applause didn't end with the speech. It rippled, deep and full. Not performative. Not political. And Harold? He didn't clap. Not one movement. He sat stone still while everyone else rose to their feet. But he didn't look away. I met his eyes, just for a second. Not in defiance. Not even in triumph. Just to show him, this is what you tried to bury. Afterward, journalists asked for interviews. Event organizers pressed my hand, thanking me. Other speakers approached to discuss collaborations. For the first time, my inbox wasn't full of follow-ups to someone else's credit, it was mine. I found a quiet moment near the refreshment table, sipping water and watching people swirl around the room like they were orbiting something new. I had no entourage. No one ushering me from conversation to conversation. I didn't need that kind of framing anymore. I was the moment. Micah. The voice came from behind. I turned. Harold stood there, his expression neutral but strained. He paused. Well delivered. I didn't offer him a smile. Thank you, I said. He cleared his throat. You've done well? I stared at him. Let the silence stretch just long enough. I know. He looked down, then up. There was a time I thought you'd quit. That you weren't built for this world. There was a time you made sure I believed that too, I said. He nodded. Maybe I did. And for once, he didn't try to rewrite the past. He didn't offer excuses or reframe his actions in the glow of hindsight. He just stood there, the man who once held the mic, watching someone else hold it now. I'm not asking for anything, he said. Good, I replied. Because I don't owe you anything. He lingered for a second longer, then left without another word. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I walked back into the conversation that was mine now. Into a world that finally saw me not as someone's husband, not as someone almost there, but as the man who built something lasting, not out of rage, not for revenge, but because I was never asking for a legacy. I was building one, and it was never theirs to claim. There's a quiet that follows vindication, an unfamiliar, weightless kind of quiet. It doesn't come with trumpets or fireworks. It doesn't arrive with a crowd. It's not applause that sticks with you. It's the moment after everyone's gone home and you're left alone with the version of yourself they once called impossible. That's where I found myself weeks after the Global Medical Innovation Forum. In the silence. In the calm after the storm they never saw coming. I'd returned to Seattle, to my office at Kellerman Institute, where the name on the glass door now matched the one on the lecture circuits. Dr. Micah Brandt. It was there on the patents, on the journals, on the whiteboards and research grants. It was no longer whispered or questioned. It was placed at the front, and it stood alone. No more introductions that started with, "This is Astrid's husband." No more comparisons to Harold. No more shrinking. My phone buzzed softly against the desk. A message from a junior researcher across the building. "Hey, Dr. Brandt, quick question. Do you mind looking at the new beta interface? We modeled it after your original diagnostic logic. Want to be sure it still aligns." I typed back one word. Sure. No titles. No over-explanation. Just presence. And that was enough. Later that day, I was scheduled to deliver a guest lecture at a nearby university. Nothing formal, just a classroom full of second-year med students studying bioinformatics and emergency systems. I liked those rooms. They reminded me of where I began, back before the world decided I wasn't enough. I arrived a few minutes early and stood just outside the lecture hall. I overheard two students talking, flipping through a printed packet. I read his article on real-time anomaly detection in disaster relief zones. Insane work. Yeah, didn't know he was also the guy who developed that mobile triage app in Honduras last year. I smiled faintly. I didn't correct them. I didn't announce myself. I just stepped in when it was time and started the lecture. 10 minutes in, a hand shot up. "Dr. Brandt, didn't they try to leave your name off that original diagnostic sequencing paper?" I paused. Not because it startled me, but because I hadn't heard anyone ask that question so directly before. I nodded. Yes, they did. The student blinked, unsure what to say next. I leaned on the table. Let me explain something. People will try to define you by how they first met you. That's their habit, not your obligation. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself that makes them more comfortable. They were quiet, listening. I let people lie about me for a long time. I let them write stories that left me out. I stayed quiet because I thought truth would find its way without help. But truth doesn't just rise. You build it. You carry it like weight. You reinforce it, protect it, speak it, even when your voice shakes. A girl in the second row scribbled fiercely into her notebook. "Some of you will be erased," I said. Not because you're not brilliant, but because someone else is afraid of what you might become if you're seen too clearly. No one looked away. You don't fight back by begging to be included. You fight by becoming undeniable. That landed. After the class, a few students stayed behind to thank me. One said her sister had used the emergency app during a flood response in Colombia. Another asked how to start building without institutional support. I answered every question. Not like someone lecturing from a stage, but like someone who had once stood exactly where they stood. Unseen, underestimated, but far from finished. I left the university just as the sun dipped behind the skyline. My phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Hello?" There was a pause. "Micah." It was Astrid. Her voice was steadier than before, but the tension still lived beneath it, like a fraying wire under a rug. "I won't take much of your time," she said. I didn't respond. I just wanted to say. I saw the speech. The forum keynote. Still silent. "You were incredible," she added. The kind of incredible I never let myself see. I stood by the window of my office, watching the city move beneath me. "I didn't call for forgiveness," she said, softer now. "I called because I realized something. I spent years clinging to a version of you that was easy to control. And when you grew past that, I didn't follow. I just wanted you to know that I see it now." I let the silence breathe. "You don't need to say anything," she added quickly. "Just, I wanted to say it. Finally." And she hung up. I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace. Because the truth had finally done what it always promises to do when given time and space. It had arrived. It had stood tall in rooms built to keep it out. And now, even the people who tried to erase it had to whisper its name. Micah Brandt. That name wasn't a footnote anymore. It wasn't a second thought. It was an origin, a presence, a statement. And when someone stopped me the next day at the airport lounge and asked, "Are you the chief doctor?" I didn't smile out of pride. I didn't correct them. I didn't offer credentials or affiliations. I just said, yes, not to prove them wrong, but to honor the truth I built in their absence. They never saw me, but the world does now.